So with Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children shortly to be slithering his way back into Warhammer 40k, which of the Primarchs do people most want to see come back next? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking future Primarch possibilities, going through the list of the ones that weren't expunged from history, and talking through which ones people would most like to see on the tabletops of Warhammer 40k once more, and which ones should stay dead and buried. In more recent times in 40k, the Primarchs have definitely been one of the things that have made the biggest hype and impact. Previously, for the vast majority of 40k's history, they tended to be more sort of eldritch mythological figures from days long past, the Emperor's band of demigods that might have founded their certain Space Marine legions and things, but are no more, or at least the demon ones maybe not being quite so active in the current setting, occasionally surfacing to spectacular effects like Angron on Armageddon. In general though, for the vast majority of them, it did feel like Games Workshop had left themselves enough room to bring them back if they wanted to. Most of the demon ones were generally considered to be still out there, and the vast majority of the loyalist ones still have room enough to return in one way or another, most of them having mysteriously disappeared more so than actually confirmed dead. I feel like some people have mixed feelings about the Primarchs coming back to the current setting, perhaps with the whole feeling of 40k changing from a more sort of slightly static setting to a slowly progressing narrative, and particularly with the setting's timeline progressing beyond the end of the 41st millennium. It does seem that Games Workshop have capitalised on that with having various Primarchs return in big dramatic lore events. In any case, so far we've had 6 Primarchs come back: Guilliman and the Lion for the Loyalists, Angron Magnus and Mortarion for the Chaos, and then Fulgrim very shortly to be on the way for the Emperor's Children. Regardless of making narrative sense and things, it seems near guaranteed that Games Workshop will keep on making more and releasing more of these, as they are just really popular, really cool figures from the lore, and generally they tend to bring out their best work with their miniatures. Great big exciting centerpiece models that have a whole ton of lore and story behind them, as built up by the days in the Horus Heresy novels, and this seems to translate into enormous sales for them. I believe they said that Mortarion was their single best-selling model ever at one point, and when they released Lionel Johnson at the end of 9th edition, their first box set with the Blade Guard veterans sold out ridiculously quickly, and then so did the individual release after that. Seems like they just couldn't really make enough of him. Over the past few editions, it looks like it's been a sort of 1 to 2 of them per edition as a big focal exciting release, and perhaps sensibly deciding to drip feed out the excitement and things so they kind of have content for years and decades to come really. In any case, with that in mind and Fulgrim's return, I thought it could be interesting to take a look at sentiments as to which Primarch should come next. Fulgrim did seem like the most obvious one, given that he was the only deity Primarch without his miniature yet, besides the undivided ones that are still active. In any case, for this one I thought we'd go through the Primarchs in the order of how much channel viewers wanted to see them come back, done by a poll of around 500 people, rating which ones they'd most like to see back on the tabletop. Alongside that question, I also asked people which ones they thought that Games Workshop would be most likely to bring back or not, which for a few of them seems to be kind of in tandem, though perhaps a bit more towards the top of the list. It feels like the fan desires for ones to return maybe aren't quite the exact same as the ones that are expected to come next. In any case though, let's jump right into it, and as with previous times when I took a look at this topic, it seems that Horus Lupercal, the War Master himself, is the least popular one to bring back, his death being a pretty canon event in the entire story of Warhammer 40k, so you might risk undoing quite a lot of the big narrative and feel of the setting if he suddenly popped up again. Horus was the Primarch of the Lunar Wolves that became the Sons of Horus and then the Black Legion, and as we all know, threw his lot in with the ruinous powers and turned half of the Space Marine legions against the Emperor, being the namesake of a certain heresy. He was imbued with titanic strength from the 4 deities of chaos, and was only laid low by the Emperor himself, though it cost the Master of Mankind dearly and to be interred on the Golden Throne. It's kind of interesting that Horus fighting the Emperor at the climax of the heresy has been retold recently in a more detailed way than before with that recent End and Death novel series. It was interesting to see the similarities and differences between that. One thing that did seem to be picked up on was there wasn't really any massive hints that the Emperor had destroyed him body and soul, as had been said in the past, which I'm not sure if it very, very slightly just raises the possibility of a return in some form with some sort of weird warp trickery. Realistically though, he does seem like the very most unlikely to come back, slain by the Emperor himself in about the most canon event ever in Warhammer 40k. It feels like he's about as unlikely to get a model in the current Warhammer 40k setting as the Emperor himself is. In general, I think people's feelings are mostly that Horus should remain as the big bad from the past, Abaddon and the Black Legion having moved on and taking up the Long War in the future, and Abaddon does really seem to be going for the same sort of tropes in the current 40k setting. It also looks like you guys voted as him in very last place for Games Workshop's likelihood of bringing him back, which seems sensible to me. But just in general, I can see why people have no real massive desire for the lore dead Primarchs to return, even if they're big names, and I'm sure they'd have lots of interest for their models. It just maybe kind of cheapens the lore if big important characters can't die and have an end to their story. Next up, and also notably for being a very, very dead Primarch, is Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands, a great smith and weapon crafter with a lot of personal might in himself as well, his hands coated in necrodermis, giving him a lot of his augmented strength to be able to fashion things to his will. He's perhaps one of the lesser explored Primarchs out of the lot of him, as Fulgrim cut his story short in the Horus heresy in the quite early days of that, in the treachery of the drop site massacre beheading one of his closest friends and allies. Between a fairly straightforward and tragic story and a brutally direct death, again, he does seem like he'd be one of the very least likely for Games Workshop to resurrect in one way or another. I feel like in recent times in 40k, Games Workshop have maybe been playing up the supernatural elements of their Primarchs just a bit. Say for example with Lionel Johnson doing forest walking magic, which he certainly didn't do in the Heresy. But with his focus on technology, it feels like Ferrus Manus was probably one of the more grounded in realism sort of Primarchs compared with some of the rest. I guess if they did have to try and find some sort of way to crowbar him back into the current setting, maybe some sort of archaeotech or clone resurrection, though the clone Primarchs in the past maybe have been ones that were just present for a short time as part of a story and then dead, or doing something like Legion of the Damned Ferrus Manus, utilising those sort of Imperial demons pretty much as another way to get him back perhaps. In any case though, it doesn't really seem particularly likely, and even if Games Workshop did want to put him back on the agenda, I suspect that he wouldn't be super high up, both between the lore and while the Iron Hands have their following, they're maybe not one of the super well collected out of the core codex chapters. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Melted Minis, and these guys are a commission painting studio that's based in London in the UK. You can see a couple of examples of their rather spectacular work on screen right now. This is basically the business of a guy called Kai, a slightly newer commission painter, having started within the last year, but already has a fairly awesome back catalogue. And the way that 40k commission painters often work is that you can contact them for a quote on a project, and then they work with you to deliver what you have in mind. As with most of the commission painters, there's different levels of quality that they can go for. These are the more sort of standard level sort of block colours with a basic bit of highlighting and shading, though I must admit plenty of these look really quite striking. I do like the bold blue and red of the Kraken Tyranids. Then these are examples of his prestige level, aimed for more characters and centerpieces, this one having smoother blends and transitions and some non-metallic metal work if needed. There's a cool bit of OSL on that Great Unclean one as well. And then here's the sort of designer level, going to the next level to create a custom colour scheme, like this rather awesome glowy avatar of Cain, or the custom Emperor's Children Knights on the left. In any case, here's a rough breakdown of his rates. Commission painting often tends to be a bit more economical for bigger vehicles and things like that, or making a big expensive centerpiece model look seriously nice, and the prestige cost is around about plus 80% to the rest of this. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring the video though, and I'll leave his email and Etsy page links down in the video description, and feel free to check him out on Instagram at Melted Minis. Continuing with our look through the Primarchs though, next up we have the Angel himself in Sanguinius. He was voted 10th out of 12 for fan desire to bring him back. The Primarch of the Blood Angels, again one of the more notably dead ones, a generally well loved and respected figure throughout the Imperium in life, and a masterful duelist capable of running rings around Demon Primarch Angron. He did still always have a darker side when enraged in battle. Again, as a sort of founding part of Blood Angels lore, he was slain by the War Master at the height of the Horus heresy, martyred on the vengeful spirits before the Emperor was able to reach the War Master and commit to the fight himself. As a result, his death and martyrdom is pretty fundamental to the entire story of the Blood Angels, rather perfect heroes but with tragic flaws, and in particular their descent into madness at the Black Rage with their death visions of Sanguinius. Again, I feel like he's the sort of model that loads of people would probably pick up if Games Workshop did decide to bring him back for 40k, just as it to be very, very cool. But on the other hand, it would just undo a lot of the lore and not really make too much sense, and people think he's very unlikely to return, both from a Games Workshop point of view and wanting to see him return in general. Perhaps one of the things that seemed most possible for a way to get him back into the current setting, or at least in a weird form, might have been the Sanguinor, which Imperial scholars have been speculating was a sort of collective yearning for Sanguinius coming back, and to be honest I wouldn't have been enormously surprised if Games Workshop had made a sort of Primarch-sized Sanguinor as the update for it, but that's not what we got when they did redo him. In any case, between the two, he was both voted low for desire to return to the 40k setting, and also for likelihood for GW to make a model. Next up, for the fourth of the more confirmed dead ones, we have Konrad Curze, the twisted Night Haunter of the Night Lords. He's often been perhaps the most wretched of the Primarchs, obsessed with a twisted sense of justice and using brutal acts of terror and fear to achieve it, no matter the cost to the unfortunates that stand in his way. He showed very little care or affection for his sons in the Legion, perhaps less so than any other Primarch, and was constantly beset by dark visions of his death and other horrors of the future, which gradually led to him becoming utterly mad and deranged. Post-heresy, Curze was slain by the Kalatus assassin Emshen, and it seems that as he'd seen his death coming in this way, he basically allowed himself to be executed willingly, and his head was carried off as proof of the kill, though I believe it never made its way all the way back to Terra. I believe there was a book that explored some of the consequences just after that, so it's not exactly like a presumed death off screen like some of the other Primarchs maybe, so again it just seems far less likely to be justified in returning. I don't know if they could go with some sort of idea as to his soul going into the warp and then coming back as some form of demon, though again that also feels like it doesn't really work quite so well, given that he never really ascended to demonhood like most of the rest of his Primarch contemporaries. Talking of demons and the ruinous powers though, next up was voted Lorgar. In terms of fans' desire to see a Primarch come back, it looks like out of the living Primarchs, Lorgar was the least favourite, though still voted massively more than the last four, and realistically only fractionally under the next 6 on the list pretty much, all of which were kind of close together with desire to bring back. Lorgar is Primarch of the Word-Bearers, the Golden Evangelist of Chaos, who turned against the Emperor when he was forbidden from worshipping him as a deity, and set out in search of gods that were worthy of his attention. While he's not really all that far behind the others in terms of hype for his return, he maybe just feels like his lore hasn't been quite as standout or exciting as a few of the rest of them, generally tending to be coming off second best in any one-on-one encounters with his brothers or similar. I'm not saying he doesn't have some cool lore in his own right though, but just maybe trying to theorise as to why he was voted a little bit lower than some. That kind of rings true for the last major thing that we knew about him at the end of the heresy. Corvus Corax trying to hunt him down within the Eye of Terror, giving him a good rending with the lightning claws, and causing Lorgar to flee inside a great tower, slamming great fortified doors behind him to keep his shadowy brother at bay. By all accounts, he's still very much alive and well in the current Warhammer 40k setting though, a demon Primarch of Chaos Undivided, and I believe one of the more recent Chaos Space Marine codexes spoke of rumours of him being abroad in the galaxy once again at the head of a great legion of word-bearers, spreading the word of the true gods to an unsuspecting galaxy. As a result, being a big character from the current setting who sounds like he's active and out of his tower once again right now, it does seem very likely that Games Workshop will get around to him at some point, and there's not any reason that Games Workshop couldn't choose to bring him back at any point really. I guess now we're getting full grim, it'd probably be him or Perturabo for the ones that are around and confirmed active. It looks like people raised him just a little bit higher for likelihood to come back next, at 6th out of 12 there. Rated slightly above Lorgar though was Alpharius or possibly Ermagon, the heads of the Hydra and the twin Primarchs of the Alpha Legion. Very little is known about them, with Alpharius sort of being the public face, though his brother apparently subbing in for him, and both of them able to pass undetected in a way that most other Primarchs couldn't, hiding amongst their battle brothers when it made sense to them. The Alpha Legion have generally been a bit of a mystery abroad in the galaxy ever since, uncertain allies to everyone including their fellow traitor legions, and it's all too common for Alpha Legion warlords to declare themselves as Alpharius, though hard evidence of the Primarch's existence in the galaxy still hasn't ever really been proven. For the lore within the Horus heresy, Alpharius was believed to be slain by Dorn on Pluto, and it's believed that Rabute Guilliman slew Ermagon post-heresy in a great battle. Though given deception and subterfuge is the Alpha Legion's entire thing, it's kind of impossible to know 100% one way for the other, and it feels like either one or the other one would have had a good chance to have survived, and feels like it wouldn't exactly be massively surprising to anyone if one or both of those Primarchs turned out not to have died after all. In terms of Games Workshop likelihood to bring them back, again I do feel like they're perhaps lower priority than some, as a slightly more relatively niche Chaos Space Marine Legion, albeit one with some really cool lore. Maybe in theory being lore dead is a bit of a discouragement, but perhaps a bit less so than the other 4 that we've mentioned already who far more had their kills confirmed. You guys put them 8 out of 12 for likelihood to bring them back, but again far higher than the previous slain Primarchs. Next up, out of the 6 Primarchs remaining, the next 4 were pretty much all very even in terms of fan desire to bring them back, and I thought it made sense to just give them all joint 3rd place, as that just seems a little bit more realistic of what was said. First up, let's start with Leman Russ of the Space Wolves, the Wolf King of Fenris and a mighty warrior with a brash and pragmatic approach to warfare. probably one of the very scariest Primarchs to fight in hand-to-hand combat, and led the Space Wolves in their duty as the Emperor's executioners during the Horus heresy. They were tricked into carrying out their duties over-enthusiastically against the Thousand Sons. Post-heresy, 200 years after the Emperor's interment on his golden throne, Leman Russ took his most trusted bodyguards with him and ventured off on a mysterious quest known only to him, leaving only Bjorn the Fell-Handed to rule the Space Wolves in his wake and vowing to return at the hour of the chapter's greatest need. I'm not sure if there's any absolute confirmation as to exactly what he was in search for, though I've seen people speculate that it could have been something called the Tree of Life, thought to be a possibility to try and restore the Emperor. In terms of likelihood to return via Games Workshop though, it does seem that people in general feel like he's probably the next most logical pick. He was voted first out of the 12 in likelihood to return, perhaps as much as anything else from a pure model range and chapter development point of view. The Space Wolves, Blood Angels and Dark Angels have had a big model range and a lot of individual chapter support for a really long time now. They feel like they were the original big three of the Divergent chapters, even if Black Templars and Death Watch were developed a bit after. With the Lion back and Sanguinius long dead, and if Dorn were to return, it'd be more for the Imperial Fist than the Black Templars in terms of heraldry and theming. It feels like out of Games Workshop's big and developed chapters, Leman Russ and the Space Wolves do seem like the logical choice really. And to be honest, I think it would be a surprise if one of the other Loyalist Primarchs came back before him. Space Wolves are due a big range update. We've had Blood Angels and Dark Angels already in 10th edition, and Games Workshop really seem to have been dropping a whole bunch of Space Wolf content and teasers, such as things hinting to Bjorn the Fell-Handed and Logan Grimnar over the year, plus a mysterious hype teaser. It kind of implies that the Space Wolves are the next big model release wave after a bunch of other codexes come out. I guess we'll find out then whether or not he's coming back in 10th edition, unless they decide to leave him for a later edition in an end edition campaign or something like that, similar to the Lion. While we're talking about the Space Wolves, it's maybe worth mentioning that they did have a prophecy that could be talking about Primarchs coming back to Warhammer 40k. This excerpt is from a 2018 book called Ashes of Prospero by Gav Thorpe. So it came out not too very long after Mortarion and Gilliman's models came out, and Magnus had already been around for a little while. This one just seems to talk about really quite a lot of the Primarchs, though notably not all of them. A sleeper in the rock that's the Lion, a white storm that is Jaghatai, a shadow that's Corvus Corax, and then talking about all the still existent Chaos Primarchs besides Perturabo, it seems. They're basically saying no hints of Leman Russ himself at that point. Games Workshop do have a bit of a habit of dropping model teasers, both in their codex and in their novels and things, but I'm still not sure whether it's particularly worth overinterpreting either. Though I guess if this is Games Workshop's release schedule but in a cryptic form, it could hint to Jaghatai and Corvus Corax before Russ, and maybe Lorgar before Perturabo. I guess we'll see what happens on that front though, just given that Russ seems like he's probably the most obvious one from a more sort of common sense model sales and refreshing the Space Wolves point of view. Otherwise though, for the other Primarchs also voted in joint third, next up we have Rogal Dorn of the Imperial Fists. He's the Golden Praetorian of Terror, the Guardian to the Throne, and with the Imperial Fist expertise, marshalled the defence of the system during the Horus heresy, when they were beset on all sides by numerous legions and thoroughly outnumbered. He's perhaps one of the most resolute and loyal sons of the Emperor, and proved thoroughly immune to the temptations of Khorne, when the Chaos Gods tested him quite so thoroughly upon his recent excursion into the Vengeful Spirit. He's another one of the loyalist Primarchs that more sort of had a mysterious disappearance as opposed to confirmed death. He was leading an attack on the bridge of a great Chaos ship when he was lost, and I believe at that point I think he was the last of the loyalist Primarchs active in the galaxy at that point. I believe in older lore they said that they'd recovered his body, though after that it was changed to his brothers only recovering a skeletal hand in a gauntlet, now a sacred relic of the chapter. For Games Workshop likelihood to bring back, it seems like he's maybe a lower chance than Russ, but out of the remaining loyalists just about as likely as any other perhaps. Again, he's had no real confirmed death, and just maybe more of a question as to where he'd have been hidden for around 10k years. Maybe imprisoned by the forces of chaos or something, though it might seem all rather obliging of them to look after him nicely rather than just killing him. Out of the sort of more Codex chapter Primarchs, he does seem to be about as likely as the other three though. Speaking of which, next up we have Jaghatai Khan of the White Scars. The Great Khan may be standing as a bit of an outsider and independent thinker versus quite a few of the Primarchs, maybe renowned for a bit more pragmatism and common sense, at least compared with a number of his brothers, but still being known for his ferocity and favouring swift lightning strikes as his preferred method of dealing with problems. In the lore, his disappearance was being lost in the webway pursuing Eldar raiders, refusing to let his quarry escape, though he seems to have been either incapacitated or trapped to the extent where he couldn't return to the galaxy and his battle brothers. With such a vague disappearance of that though, literally anything could have happened to him. It'd be really quite easy to bring him back lore-wise, perhaps being sealed off in some dark corner of the webway, or imprisoned by the Harlequins or Drukhari or something. And if so, hopefully the former rather than the latter for his sake. If he is still within the webway though, then Vashtor the Archifane just got his hands on a webway tunneling device in the world of Wormwood as well. If he's trapped in some great big webway vault, that could be one narrative device for him to return to the fore, or potentially if Games Workshop decides to focus on the Harlequins or the Drukhari again more formally, maybe that could be another narrative reason to bring him back. Seems like it was also voted really quite high in terms of people's expectations for Games Workshop to bring him back. I feel like maybe the biggest thing against that might be just the fact that the White Scars have generally been quite a niche chapter within 40k setting in general. Again, some really cool lore and theming like the rest of them, but just maybe not quite as well known as some of the other core codex chapters, or certainly the divergent ones. Finally, for the four of them that were more or less the same level at joint third, here we have the bitter and twisted siege matter that is Perturabo, Primarch of the Iron Warriors Chaos Space Marines. He is particularly well renowned to be a brutal and mighty warrior and a masterful tactician, his Iron Warriors both in the Heresy and after often bearing a disproportionate amount of load and hardship placed upon them, perhaps the reward for success being ever greater tasks which ultimately turned him against the Emperor, and all too willing to throw his lot in with Horus come the Heresy. Aside from the ones that actually have had their models back and a bit more of attention in the lore, he has been maybe the other most active Chaos Primarch post-Heresy. He's currently believed to be a demon Primarch of Chaos Undivided, residing on the world of Medrengard, and has maybe had a few more recent lore teasers versus Lorgar. Apparently there were some reports of him leading a great siege in the Segmentum Obscurus since the Great Rift opened, and has had some somewhat recent lore of him personally dueling Mortarion as well. I believe the Iron Warriors ultimately being driven back over a conquest over the contents of some ancient ruins. He has also had some direct contact with Vashtor as well, and it does feel like they might have a fair bit in common, with Perturabo being a Primarch of brutal siege warfare mechanisms and firepower. It seems that if Vashtor ever did ascend to full-on Chaos Godhood, then perhaps Perturabo might have a bit more affinity there, perhaps more so than any other one of the current Chaos deities. Again, as a current major figure in the lore, and still being very much out there in Warhammer 40k in general, it seems kind of near guaranteed when they do eventually get round to him. As mentioned, for Chaos Primarchs coming up after Fulgrim, it'll logically be either him or Lorgar next, and I kind of wonder if it might be some sort of catalyst to do his model if they wound up doing a sort of Dark Mechanicum or Vashtor themed army in Warhammer 40k at some point. Perhaps some of the manufactured love of the Chaos deities could fall on him as well. I guess if Dorn ever comes back as well, then it could be a good reason to have them return in tandem. There's probably some old grudges to settle since the Iron Cage. In any case, for actual expectation for him to come back, he seems to be a bit lower voted than some of the Loyalist Primarchs. He was only rated 7 out of 12 there, so despite being a current existent Primarch in Warhammer 40k, most of the Loyalists might be expected to turn up before him, at least in most people's eyes. Finally though, in getting into the top voted 2 for the ones that people most wanted to see, Corvus Corax of the Raven Guard was just nosing ahead the previous 4 that we talked about. The Raven Lord fighting from jump pack and using twin lightning claws to cut his foes apart, exemplifying stealth and precision of his legion, and again maybe having a bit more of a practical approach to warfare, mixing the might of the Codex Astartes with the willingness to use guile and strike the enemy before they could be struck, often with a good liking for jump packs. As mentioned with the disappearance of Lorgar, who was last seen ripping some new holes in the Primarch of the Wordbearers, and deep in the Eye of Terror it seems that it was almost becoming a sort of Imperial Demon Primarch, transforming into an eldritch being of shadow, and flying from place to place in a bunch of shadowy blades. It sounded like he had the best of that encounter, though was kind of on a solo death mission nonetheless. But again, like the other Loyalist, maybe has more of the question as to why he's been out of the picture for quite so long. What was it that took him out of action? And if Lorgar is about in the galaxy again, why hasn't he been following him? Again, like the rest of the Codex chapters, maybe not the most obvious as to which one of those they could go with, if indeed Russ might be next. Again, the Raven Guard feel like they're one of the slightly more niche ones, along with the White Scars perhaps, at least in terms of numbers of followers, though as you can see here by the fact that he's voted quite so high, he's certainly seen as one of the more interesting Primarchs and one of the ones people want to see return. Finally, that just leaves us with one, and it seems that it's none other than Vulkan of the Salamanders that people most want to see a new model for in Warhammer 40k, and it does seem that he was at least a little bit ahead of his contemporaries as well, a bit more so than the bunch all clustered up at the second and third places. Vulkan is of course the perpetual dragon of the salamanders, a mighty warsmith and artisan, generally fighting the enemy with his sheer power and might with his big hammer. It was discovered in the Horus heresy and particularly noted at the Isfahan drop site massacre that the Primarch of the Salamanders is a perpetual, can basically recover from injury or death itself, which Konrad Curze of the Night Lords seems to enjoy putting to the test during the heresy. For his disappearance, I believe he went away for a bit and then returned in the War of the Beast and was ultimately lost in the absolutely apocalyptic explosion that came at the climax of it. They claimed the life of the next level Orc warlord that the Imperium had sought to destroy for so long. Obviously many suspecting that he perished in the explosion, though given the fact that he's a perpetual, it seems unlikely that he's actually dead. Perhaps if he survived, he might be lying low, maybe helping folks out at a more local level as opposed to being a galaxy-spanning hero, or I guess he could have been flung into the void or under a planet's core or anything like that. More in a place where he could be recovered. There was also the Salamander's entire legend of finding his artifacts and then he's returned to them, which Forge Father Vulkan has done, and his predecessors have uncovered several of Vulkan's relics. In terms of likelihood to return, it's very easy to justify him coming back given that he's probably likely still alive given that he's a perpetual, and maybe the fact that he looks like he is really quite popular compared with many of his brothers could be another thing that might nudge them to address him sooner rather than later. Again though, beyond that, doesn't necessarily seem like he's massively more likely than the rest of his currently missing in action loyalist brothers, but in any case it still looks like people think that he's a bit more likely than most, second out of the 12 ranked for likelihood to return. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on the Primarchs though. Which one would you most like to see a new miniature realised for Warhammer 40k? And which do you think out of them that Games Workshop is most likely to bring back? Here's just the lists of how people ranked them out there on the poll that I did. This one's the one for the ones that people are expecting to come back next. It does seem that there's quite a lot of loyalists towards the top of that, and Lorgar and Perturabo just being a touch on the lower side. Seems kind of likely that they'd probably mix it up though, with a mix of loyalists and chaos coming back as they've been doing so far. And this was the breakdown for the votes of which Primarchs you want to see next. Vulkan really quite a long way out the top for that, but otherwise a lot of love for basically all the other ones that are either living or missing in action. And despite rumours of his death, Alpharius does seem to have infiltrated that section of them. I'll leave this one there though. Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below. And as mentioned, feel free to check out Melted Minis if you'd like to get some commission painting done of one sort or another. They've got some fun centerpiece offerings, or their more standard battle ready service if you either want to get a bunch of minis painted up to put on the table or have something really special. Their contact details will be linked down in the video description. If you'd like to see more like this, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you'd like to help support, I'd just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case though, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.